Hi, everyone. A lot of people have asked me what it was like to meet The Cure, to meet Robert Smith and the members of The Cure. And because they know that I spent some time in the 80s hanging out with the band. And first of all, this is not going to be a sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of story because they didn't really like to. I think they like to drink more than they like drugs, and they really weren't the kind of band that was out to seduce their fans after every concert. So, the first concert, the first time I discovered The Cure was in around 1980, and I had given up on rock and roll and was listening to a lot of classical music. And one of my professors, Louis Mackey, came up to me and he said, I saw this pin on his lapel that had the graph of a dying star. And I said, what is that? He said, that is a Joy Division pin. And I said, what is Joy Division? And this was 1980. And he said, it's a rock band. And I said, oh, you listen to rock and roll? Like, rock, it's dead. And I'm listening to classical now. So he handed me 2 albums, 2 cassette tapes. He said, just take these home and listen to them. One of them was The Walk by The Cure, and the other one was Pornography by The Cure. And that's an unfortunately titled album because there's nothing pornographic about the album. It's an album about suicide and death, and it's a very dark album, but it's not particularly pornographic. I think they chose it for shock value. In any case, the first concert at which I met, the first concert I went to by The Cure was on November 2nd, 1984, at a place called the Austin Opry House, Opry. Sounds like something Texas would come up with. Actually, it was owned by Willie Nelson, but you never saw him around. So it was run by someone else, and it was kind of a cool little venue. But the interesting thing is that this first concert where I saw The Cure was, they were not a famous band at the time. And if you wanted to get one of their albums, you had to go to this little bookstore and import it from England because they had so little fame at the time that you could not buy their albums in a regular record store. So you had to go score them at a little offbeat bookstore in New Austin where we used to go score these. Come back to the philosophy department and go, wow, I scored a Joy Division album today. Yeah, it was fun. That was cool before the internet. It was very cool. But, Louis Mackey and I and one undergraduate decided we were going to go see this concert. So Mackey drove and he picked the 2 of us up, and they were not famous. They had so little fame that he could actually sign albums at a bookstore and not get mobbed. He was actually at a bookstore. I didn't go meet him there. And I really wasn't an obsessed Cure fan at that time. I heard their music. I loved their music. I wanted to see their music. It was not until after the first concert, that I totally fell in love with their music. And I think you really have to see a band live. I think it's very important. And it's unfortunate about the pandemic because, anyway, I tend to lose my train of thought because I'm old and I have a disease that attacks the brain, and, so just bear with me. So we went to this concert, and there could not have been 500 people there. And they were touring for the album, The Top, which never really made it big. And the songs they played were Shake Dog Shake, The Hanging Garden, A Forest. A lot of their really great songs were played at this concert. And at the end of the concert, Louis Mackey and I looked at each other and we were like, wow. Like we'd had this religious experience. And he turned to me and he said, they really are great. And it was after that concert that I became completely obsessed with them. So then I went off to teach. It would have been very easy to get backstage then because there was such a small venue. And I just can't believe I went to a Cure concert where there were only 500 people there because they weren't famous enough. Because only 2 years later, the concert would be huge and they would be mobbed. But, so we didn't get backstage at that one, and we didn't try to. It would have been easy, but we didn't try. And so then I went off to teach philosophy at the University of New Orleans, and I came back and there was a concert being given at the City Coliseum in 1986. I can't give you the exact date. It was the summer of 1986. And that's the first concert where I did meet Robert Smith. I'm looking up the date right now as we speak. July 18th, 1986. And I flew from New Orleans to Austin to visit friends and to go to the concert. Once again, Louis Mackey and I and a number of undergraduates, more of them this time. We were the only two older people that went to see The Cure. And it was a pretty big concert, maybe about, I don't know, it seemed like there might have been 5,000, 6,000 people, maybe. And this was at the City Coliseum. And the way you get backstage is you be very persistent. I mean, I kept running around. I was going to meet Robert Smith. I always meet my idols. And I only had really two rock idols. One was Steve Winwood, and I met him in the 70s. And it was so very different in the 70s. Because I went to a concert in New Orleans, and everybody, including the band and the entire population of the fans, were completely wiped out, stoned. I mean, people were really out of it. And I sort of just was sort of out of it, and I wandered my way backstage. I don't even remember if the guards were even checking. And Winwood was sitting in the middle of two other guys, and he was just like wiped out. And I went up to him, and I was very insecure when I was that age. I was probably 19 and maybe 20, I don't know, 18, 19, 20. And I was a little overweight. I had that undergraduate, freshman 30-pound weight gain. And I was, but I was going to meet with Steve Winwood. And I went back and I said, your music is, really great. And he was like, yeah. And then I walked away, and that was it. There wasn't much to it. And anyway, but back to the Cure story. So I, Louis Mackey, and the number of undergraduates stood at the gate. And there was this, rope that separated the fans, and we just waited and waited and waited and pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally, the guard just said, okay, come on back. You guys, it's okay for you guys to come back. I said to the guard, we are philosophy professors at the University of Texas. And Mackey turned to me later and he said, Marianne, you're not a philosophy professor at the University of Texas. I said, Louis, when you're trying to get backstage, the truth is what works. Remember your pragmatism? All I cared about was meeting Robert Smith. I didn't care about the truth. But I was teaching at UNO at that time. But in any case, we got backstage. And I was walking towards where the band was sitting. And Robert Smith and this very young girl, who was standing even further away from him than I was, the two of them just locked eyes. I could tell she was an obsessed Cure fan and she loved his music. But to her, he was the music. Him, the person, was the music. So when she locked eyes with him, it was like she was locking eyes with that music. And he locked eyes back with her, and they just had this exchange that was just very intense. And I did not have that reaction. I went up, my first reaction was, oh, you mean he's actually a human being? I thought he was a god. You know, my view is that the musician is simply the medium through which the muses speak. And so, but anyway, I was happy to meet him, and so Mackie and I walked up there, and the first thing that struck me was that he was not as eccentric as I thought he was. For the kind of offbeat, out of the mainstream music that he wrote, he was really much more normal than his music. And I was way far further out of the mainstream than he was. And that was surprising to me. And I walked up to him and I took his hand and I kissed the back of his hand like he was royalty. And he kind of looked at me like I was kind of strange. So I kissed the back of his hand. I looked at him and I said, "Your voice is so beautiful." And he looked back at me and he said, Oh, thank you very much. That's so very sweet of you to say. Sweet. No, I don't think so. I was sweet. Yeah, right. No, your voice is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And so he was, it seemed to me that he had these sort of, he probably was someone who just had heard that a million times from a million fans. And I just felt like I was just another fan who, liked his music. And he didn't see that I was special, that I was the person who has the best taste in music of any human being you'll ever meet on the entire planet. And that he was getting this information, this compliment from someone like me who actually knows the truth about the music. Anyway. And that was really pretty much the gist of the exchange. We really didn't spend much time with him. Mackie had a conversation with a couple of other band members, and we left, and we didn't hang out with them at that concert. And that was the one in 1986. And then I moved back to Austin to finish my doctoral dissertation. I'm looking up the dates of the other one. And another concert came along at by the way, it was at the City Coliseum where the one in 1986 was. And abandoning their college fans, The Cure was so big then, by 1987, that they played a larger venue they could have played a very large venue in Austin, but instead they chose to go to Houston. And they went to a place called the Sam Houston Coliseum in Houston, Texas. And this was on July 3rd, 1987. And there were probably 15,000 people in the audience at that concert, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know, somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000. They were a very big band at that time, and it was for the Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me tour, which was the first album that they did that was kind of veering towards the mainstream. And they had done this song, Just Like Heaven, which was a very popular song. It's very beautiful, but it's a pop song. And that was on that album. It's a good album. It's not my favorite of theirs. It's a very good album, though. And I hung around, typically. And I finally kept standing around and standing around, standing around. And Mackie didn't want to go because it was in Houston, and really nobody came with me. I just flew there by myself. I was too sick to drive. I was sick at the time, and I didn't feel like driving. And it's only about 2 hours from Austin to Houston, but I didn't feel like driving 2 or 3 hours. But I wanted to see The Cure again, and I ran into a couple of undergraduates from the University of Texas Philosophy Department, and so we stood around backstage at the gate, not the gate, but where the rope is, and waited for all these people to leave. And this very sweet guy, Perry Beaumont, who was a roadie at the time, he later became their guitarist, but he was a roadie at the time, and he came up to me and he said, okay, these two are all right. And so I and this young undergraduate went backstage, and we got in these limousines. There were 2 limousines to take us back to the hotel where there was a party in Robert Smith's room. And I ended up in the car, in the limousine with Lawrence Tolhurst. And Lawrence, when we got to the hotel, takes me to this room, and I walk into this room with him, and it's empty. And I was like, uh-oh. You hear all these stories these days about getting raped by, or assaulted by some rock band member, and you can't say anything about it because they're famous, but that didn't happen. But you could tell he was interested in having a little fling, but that was not going to happen. And I said, I think I'd like to go to the party in Robert's room. And he was very polite about it. He went, and we opened the door, and he delivered me to Robert's room where there was a party. And there were a lot of people there. And he went back to his room, and that was the end that I saw of Lawrence Tolhurst. And Boris Williams was sitting there, and there were a couple of very young girls on his lap, all excited about meeting a star. And once again, I had that same reaction. I had purchased up a gift for him. I had bought him Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, a book that Nietzsche wrote, because I thought that the book, which was a book he wrote about Wagner's music, but I think it actually characterizes the Cure's music more than it does Wagner's, because Wagner's music is mostly really dark. But Robert's music had this dark and light element to it. And so I gave him that, and I gave him a play, a Greek, the Oresteia, I believe. So I gave him The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, and he said thank you, and he looked at it, and so we were all sitting there talking and partying and everything, and they were drinking. And I did not like to drink because it makes my legs hurt. Even before I got sick, I used to get leg cramps. And there was a young woman who was a guitarist there, and he seemed to take an interest in her career, and he was actually very helpful towards her. And he said, and I asked him, I said, well, do you want to have lunch tomorrow? Because I really wasn't interested in, having an affair with him or anything. I just wanted to sit down and have a conversation with this frigging genius. And he kind of dodged, and he said, well, I can't be around women for too long because I get very attracted. And I wish I had thought of this, but I didn't say it, but I should have. But I don't care if you don't. And I don't want it if you don't. Insiders will know what I'm talking about. Ah, ha, 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 ha. Let's go to bed. Anyway, no, that didn't happen. And so, he said, and he and Simon Gallup was with him at that time. And he and Simon Gallup were always kissing and just kind of trying to shock everybody by the fact that we're kissing. And I almost said something really snide. I almost said, that's not shocking in America. But I held my tongue and I was polite. And anyway, so Perry Beaumont, the roadie, I told him that my ex-husband was living in New Orleans at the time, and they were going to have a concert 2 days later in New Orleans, and I wanted to go to that one too. I wanted to follow them. So Perry Beaumont said, I'm going to leave backstage passes for you at the ticket stand. And I didn't believe him. I said, no, that's not going to happen. But I was going to go to the concert anyway, so I flew to New Orleans and visited my ex-husband David. Or I don't know if we were divorced at the time, but we were separated. And he didn't want to go. I wanted to go by myself because I wanted to hang out with The Cure anyway, and he didn't want to go. He was very shy. And he was a big music fan, though, and my ex-husband was a multi-instrumentalist. He played piano, guitar. He composed music. He was an arranger. He was very, very musically astute and very talented at music. But he was lazy and just didn't want to do anything with his talent. So anyway, he didn't want to go. He wasn't into that. He did go to a Susie and the Banshees concert with me. But I didn't want him to go. I wanted to go by myself. And so, sure enough, I go to the ticket stand and I buy my ticket to get in. And I said, are there backstage passes for me? And they said, what's your name? And show me your ID. And sure enough, Perry Beaumont left those backstage passes for me. And I was really surprised. That was just very, very sweet. He was such a sweet guy. When Paul Thompson left the band, he became their guitarist, and he wasn't as good of a guitarist as Paul Thompson, but he was just a very sweet guy. And so we got, once again, after the concert, we got in these limousines and we went to the hotel. And Robert wanted to go to the Voodoo Museum or something. I'd never heard of it. But it was closed, and he wanted to know what the good bars were. Like I said, I like to drink. So I said, well, let's go to the Napoleon House, which was a pretty cool little bar in New Orleans at the time. But it was closed when we got there, so we went to this other cheesy bar. And this bartender, old guy, who didn't know who they were, he said, oh, y'all are from England? And Robert and the band were like, oh, yes, we're from England. And I kept my mouth shut because I knew they didn't want to be exposed as famous because then they would have been mobbed. But nobody really knew who they were when we were hanging out downtown. And I ran into Tolhurst again, and I said, hello, Lawrence, nice to see you again. Like, haha, you didn't get to seduce me. And Robert gave a little chuckle, and he came up to me and he said, you know what, Marianne, I'm really sorry. I apologize. Lawrence has gotten very ugly since we've become famous, which I thought was a very sweet and charming thing to say. He actually apologized that Lawrence Tolhurst had wanted to seduce me. But I mean, he wasn't, pushy about it or anything. He just, can't blame a guy for trying. But he just thought that being famous and getting a limousine was enough to, I was there to meet Robert Smith. I wasn't there to meet any of the other band members. And then somehow I ended up in Boris Williams' room this was before we met up with Robert. And when we went back in the limousines, This time I was with Boris Williams and that idiot Roger O'Donnell, who I can't stand. By the way, he's only worth $1 million, so that says something about him. And Boris Williams was genuinely interested, and he said, "Do you like the new album?" And we were in the limousine heading for the hotel. And I said, "Well, I do, but, I think their earlier work is better." And Roger O'Donnell said, "Well, you're wrong." And that was he had not been with the band prior to the Kiss Me album. So he thought the album that he was on was better. And when we got to the hotel, I overheard him say to Boris Williams, "Get rid of her." And Boris, was like, and they didn't know I was listening in. And he said, "Oh, now how am I going to do that? She's just, like they felt sorry for me or something." And I was thinking, I don't want to be around you guys anyway. I'm here to meet Robert, you idiot. Anyway, so Boris finally delivers me. He says, "Come on, I'm going to take you to Robert." And delivers me. And that was when we got in the car and, went to the bars downtown. And so Robert says, and I really got along with his roadie, Perry Beaumont, and his manager, Chris Perry, I believe his name was. And I sat and had a long conversation at the bar with his manager. And I think that, maybe that's why I didn't become a musician. Musicians can be very taciturn. They just don't have much to say. I have a drummer friend here who is very smart, a very good drummer, but he's also very taciturn. He just doesn't talk much. And Robert was not a great communicator either, even though he's a great poet and a great writer for his music. And he even said at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he said, "I'm a very bad communicator." Once again, I asked him if he would have lunch with me, and once again, he weaseled out of it. And but what struck me again was that he didn't want to hear how great his music was. I mean, he didn't. It's like he didn't believe me. I just didn't understand the humility. And Perry Beaumont, when I told him what I was doing with my life, he said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "Well, I teach philosophy. And, I have a PhD in philosophy." He said, "Oh, well, we're going to have to look up to you because that's just so exciting. And you must be really smart and everything." And I said, "No." I said, "There are a lot of people that get degrees in philosophy. All you have to do is smile and sit on the front row." No, not really. But there are a lot of idiots that graduate in philosophy. But there's some interesting people too. But I wasn't the greatest musician in the history of rock and roll. But Perry was very impressed by that, which was very sweet. And I had on a black skirt, a white shirt, my hair slicked back, and red lipstick. I was all 80s dressed, total 80s style. And high heels, black patent leather shoes with little white socks. And I was just all punked out, I looked very pretty, but Robert wasn't impressed by anything like that. And he was not impressed by the fact that I liked his music. In fact, I don't think he really liked me very much. And so we got into this discussion of Michael Jackson's music. And I said, "Yeah, his music is very intense. I really do like his voice. It's very intense." And Robert made this joke that it was a pun. He said, "Intense," like living in a tent. And I thought to myself, puns aren't funny. And I just, we just didn't really click. We didn't really click, but it didn't matter. It was okay. Because it wasn't about him. He was simply the medium. He was the person that the muses chose, that Dionysus chose to jump into and inhabit the spirit of for 10 years, from 1977 to 1987. And after that album, they never really did a good album after that. I know everybody likes Disintegration. I don't. But Robert did apologize to me for Lawrence trying to get me to stay in his room, saying, I'm really sorry about that. Lawrence has gotten very ugly since we've become famous, but he was a gentleman, though. I mean, he didn't really, I mean, I wasn't raped or anything or harassed or anything like that. And you hear these stories these days, just, my God, you'd be scared to even go backstage with any band member or any famous person. But no, they were. And Simon Gallup, talk about somebody who had nothing to say. I mean, Simon Gallup didn't say a word. And I kind of like to talk and converse. I don't think I would have been happy as a musician, as much as I love music. I have a terrible voice. And when I left, I said, you know what, I think I really don't fit in here, but I do want to tell you, Robert, that, I love your music, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And his reaction to me was that he thought, that I wanted to be near a famous person and not near, it wasn't his fame that I wanted to be near. It was his genius. It was his, and so he sort of, pulls me towards him and gives me a little kiss on the cheek. This was at the bar. And I said, thank you for all the beautiful music you've written. And I walked out, and they made no effort to make me stay. They were probably glad to get rid of it. I was the only fan who was with them at the time. And that is my story, but what really struck me about Robert was he's very much like when you see him in interviews. He's not very communicative. He's very humble, has a lot of humility, and he's, I don't think he knows how good he is. He may know, and he may be hiding it, but I think he had a lot of experience dealing with fans, I could tell, and he knew how to handle them. And when they said something obnoxious that he didn't like, I think he knew how to sort of put up with it and get around it, and anyway, I that's all I can think of. And later, Perry Beaumont became their guitarist when Paul Thompson left, and I heard that Boris Williams actually left the band because of that. And, Perry may not be a great guitarist, but, he was good enough. And, I mean, Paul Thompson was just a really fabulous guitarist, though. And the band was at their best when it was Robert Smith, Simon Gallup, Lawrence Tolhurst, Paul Thompson, and Boris Williams. But they say that Boris Williams is a really good drummer, but I have to say he did not strike me as a very smart person at all. I mean, he was just, I don't know, but he was not a total asshole like Roger O'Donnell, who is the most obnoxious person in the band. Very arrogant. He was not even there when they were doing all their great work. And he did not like me, and I did not like him. In fact, I think probably most of the band members didn't like me. I think Perry liked me, and I think that their manager and I got along really well. And I think Robert and I kind of found it towards the end of the night. It was kind of, it was cordial. There was no animosity or anything. It was just like, these are musicians. I grew up with my brother's a musician, and I spent a lot of time with musicians, and, some of them are talkative, and some of them are conversant, like my brother is, and I have a friend, Brad, who likes to talk, and But most of them are very taciturn, and they just don't have a lot to say. And so that's really all I have to say about it. He had a lot of humility. He was not as eccentric as I thought he would be. He was not as out of the mainstream in his person as he is in his music. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else to say. But anyway, that was, so I went back to my ex-husband's, or my husband, if we weren't separated at the time, I can't remember. And I told him the story about me telling Boris Williams and Roger O'Donnell that I didn't particularly like the Kiss Me album as much as I liked the earlier albums, and how Roger O'Donnell had this reaction. And my ex-husband said, Marianne, they're just a bunch of sexist rock musicians who can't understand independent thought. But Robert wasn't that way. The upper echelons of the band were not that way. That was just Roger O'Donnell. I mean, he really was kind of an idiot. I'm sorry. If you're listening to this, Roger, I don't care what you think of me. Just Google how much they're worth. Let's see, Simon Gallup is worth 10 million. Robert sold 30 million albums and is worth 26 million, which makes me think he doesn't manage his money very well, because Bernard Sumner of the New Order is also worth 26 million, and he has only sold maybe 3 or 4 million albums. But anyway, that is my story, and it's not all that interesting. I know it's not all that interesting, but people wanted to hear about it, so that's what I have to say about it. And that's long. It's a long story, and I probably bored you to death, so I think I will get off right now.